My name is Jade, and I have a confession to make. I love chick lit. Now, as a self proclaimed feminist, some may view this statement as contradictory or believe that I'm less of a feminist because I like to read romance and fantasy books that have vampires, dragons, assassins, sexy fae, and God forbid there is an enemies to lovers plot. However, I must disagree with the connotation that literature that is written by women for women is disempowering simply because it has romantic contents. The romantasy books I've read have certainly never made me feel disempowered as a woman. If anything, they've had the opposite effect. So I had to ask myself the question, since when is romance in literature and the real world an abandonment of women's agency and power? And after extensive research, the answer is when men are in control and there's a lack of women's voice and experience. When learning about media audiences and fan studies in BCM110, we explored how active audiences can have an intrapersonal relationship with media and influence the kind of media that is being produced. After discovering this, I was encouraged to consider the historical influence of women on the literary world, especially how they have shaped the romance and fantasy genres through their own fandoms. Today, we'll be exploring the history of the interpersonal relationship between women in the romance and fantasy genres, and to do this, we will explore the following topics: an early history of women as readers and authors of the romance and fantasy genres, where we will explore classic romantic literature like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and then compare his female character depictions with works by authors like Jane Austen, highlighting how differently female authors depict women in their own works. The representation of women in romantic and fantasy media, and how popular culture shapes societal ideologies. We will start by looking at how pop culture influences and enforces mass ideologies, and how it can also be a powerful instrument for societal change. We will then be looking at how the women's rights movement were instrumental to revolutionizing the romance and literary genres by inspiring female and even male authors to portray female characters and roles that were typically reserved for men. And finally, we will be exploring female written romance and fantasy texts in a modern setting, and how modern romantasy authors have built on the work of the brave women before them. We will be exploring the success that female authors have accumulated in recent years, women led communities like Book Talk, and a personal anecdote on how the liberation of feminine literature has enabled young audiences to be inspired by the positive female role models they see in these texts. To understand the impact women have had on literature, we need to go back to the beginning. Up until the mid 1800s, male doctors and medical professionals pushed harmful narratives that educated women would struggle with fertility, or reading novels would overstimulate the brain and cause hysteria, resulting in institutionalization. These ideas were designed to discourage women from reading and keeping them disempowered because an uneducated woman is easier to control and domesticate. As a result of these harmful narratives, literature was dominated by men well into the 1800s. Previously, classic romances like Romeo and Juliet often portrayed women as innocent, naive, and blindly devoted to their man. While those traits aren't inherently bad, they were used to box female characters into submissive and secondary roles. Even lead characters like Juliet were still shown through the lens of traditional femininity, being docile, domestic, and dependent. It wasn't until authors like Jane Austen came along, publishing under a pen name to avoid persecution, that we saw a shift. As Sufia Osmani and Dr. Shivani Cole explain in their paper Feminism and Literature, reclaiming the canon enduring relevance of Jane Austen's works, Austen challenges the constraints imposed on women by patriarchal society, emphasizing female agency, autonomy, and the complex realities of marriage as an economic contract. These ideas were bold and largely unwelcome by their male readers at the time. Still, Austen's Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811, sold out its initial run of about 750 to 1,000 copies. For women, it was one of the first times they saw their own experiences reflected in literature, and it inspired change. Women began to move from passive readers to active creators and producers, producing the kinds of stories that they wanted to read, where women were central, complex, and had ambitions beyond the domestic sphere. Arguably, in response to these ideas, so-called provocative texts like Lady Chatterley's Lover by T.H. Lawrence and Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert seem to serve as warnings to women to not abandon their wifely and domestic duties. Both Lady Chatterley and Madame Bovary experienced deep dissatisfaction in their marriages and domestic roles, leading them to engage in steamy, emotionally charged affairs. Both novels boldly explore female pleasure and sexuality, a move that sparked the idea that females' literature was inherently smutty or lacking in depth. Yet, despite this, both stories ultimately keep their female leads tethered to men, whether it's their fathers, husbands, or their lovers. In the case of Madame Bovary, Emma's story ends in suicide, which some critics interpret as Flaubert's cautionary message to women who dare to seek more than what society prescribes for them. This brings us to how popular culture shapes and reinforces societal ideologies, especially around gender norms and how women are represented. As we've just explored, for most of history, pop culture placed women in submissive roles such as the damsel in distress, the love interest, or simple eye candy with sex appeal, especially in the romance and fantasy genres. But as society evolved, especially with the rise of the women's rights movement, women gained more agency and visibility, and this was started to be reflected in media too. Now, you might be wondering, how can pop culture possibly undo centuries worth of gender stereotypes? Well, Lojan Altayeb explains in From Entertainment to Ideology, examining popular culture's role in shaping collective consciousness, that pop culture doesn't just reflect society, it helps shape it by reinforcing dominant ideas of the time. That might sound like a bad thing, but she depicts popular culture to be both a mirror and a potent force that can alter the social, political, and cultural norms of its day. So, how do you shift the way women are represented in media? You rewrite the story, literally. Women started creating their own media that challenged outdated narratives and used popular culture as a tool to push new ideas, and that's exactly what happened in the romance and fantasy genres. Jessica Dassler breaks this down in her report, Women in Literature, The Impact of Feminism on Fantasy Literature, where she states that before the 1960s, the fantasy literature genre was dominated by male authors writing strong male characters and one-dimensional female characters that added little to the story. The women's rights movements of the 60s and 70s led female fantasy literature authors to write literature with well-rounded, strong female characters. A great example of this is Patricia A. McKillip's The Forgotten Beast of Eld, published in 1974, with Sybil, a powerful independent sorceress who lives a reclusive life outside the patriarchal kingdom of Eldwald, where she suddenly must care for a baby, the son of the king. She's unwillingly is exposed to the harsh manipulation of patriarchal forces. She's constantly pressured by men, by societal structures, and by emotional bonds to surrender her agency. But rather than accept a path of submission, Sybil stands in her power and shapes the world of men. Sybil's story becomes one of rebellion against gender roles and society expectations, with Sybil marking a turning point. Before her, women in fantasy were usually depicted on either side of the feminine spectrum, either pure and innocent, or evil and manipulative, or completely irrelevant to the plot altogether. Now, for the first time, women could see themselves reflected in roles of real power, and not just as accessories to someone else's story, but as the heroine of their own. This pivotal era encouraged many other female and male authors to create texts with strong female protagonists, such as The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley, The Mists of Avalon by Marianne Zimmer Bradley, and Sabriel by Garth Nix, many of which inspired and paved the way for modern romance and fantasy authors. But the influence of our brave foremothers doesn't end there. Post women's rights movement, the romance and fantasy genres had gained steady popularity and it's still on the rise. In the last 3 years alone, romance novel sales have increased by 113%, generating $1.4 billion in revenue in 2023 alone, making it the highest selling fiction genre. And as per the 2022 National Survey of Australian Book Authors, 2/3 of authors are female. It is also shown that across multiple studies in multiple countries, women read more than men, and that 80% of novel sales are purchased by women. Way to go, ladies. It is evident that literature by women is more relevant than ever, and this can be accredited to many factors, but especially the book lover communities on platforms such as TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. In recent years, since the pandemic, feminine romance and fantasy has exploded in popularity thanks to the book talk and bookish communities, with authors like Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros producing works that literally take over the internet, as well as the hearts and minds of many readers, such as myself. Thanks to the hard work of our foremothers, women's literature has come so far. Even now, some of my biggest role models aren't real people but fictional heroines like Aelin Galanathius from Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas and Violent Sorrengail from Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. When Aelin is locked in a coffin, magically forced to relive her deepest fears, or when she travels through realms to save the world and the people she loves, even sacrificing her power to defeat the Valg, I'm genuinely in awe of the fierce strength and resilience of women. When life throws me curveballs, I honestly stop and ask myself, what would Aelin do? And try to channel even a little bit of her fire. These life-changing novels and series simply wouldn't be possible if women had never fought for their voices to be heard as readers, as writers, and as consumers. Ultimately, women have had an immense influence on the literary world, especially the romance and fantasy genres, through their fandoms and being active audience members. From our early trailblazers such as Jane Austen, who started to express the inner desires of women through her novels, to the brave authors such as Patricia A. McKillops, who demanded that women can be powerful heroines too, and finally, our modern authors like Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros that use the tools provided by our foremothers to inspire women today to be strong. Thanks to these generations of women who refuse to be silenced, we now have stories that not only reflect who we are, but who we have the power to become. My feedback from A2 stated that I should include relevant examples of texts and authors to enhance my argument. I have successfully incorporated that feedback in each section of my report and used them to enhance the research I had done to elucidate my arguments. I hope that you enjoyed this journey. I certainly did, and I truly hope that this work inspires you to pick up a book, regardless of your gender, and find inspiration from these powerful women.